I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, where we discuss the ideas, people, and events that have made America what it is today. We believe that by understanding our history and our principles, we can better live up to the promise of the American founding and preserve our ongoing experiment in self-government. Welcome to The American Idea.
Welcome to this episode of The American Idea. Today we're going to be talking about a story, a fascinating story in American history, full of colorful characters, full of important people, important events that help to shape and define who we are as a country. We're going to be talking about the annexation of Texas and the historical significance of it, and in some ways, the way it reverberates still through American history. And we're going to be talking about that with an old friend of this podcast and The American Idea, Professor Jordan Cash. For our listeners may know, Jordan is Assistant Professor of Political Theory and Constitutional Democracy at the James Madison Honors College at Michigan State University. You may remember him because we had a wonderful conversation on another one of Jordan's book called The Isolated Presidency, a fascinating look into presidents who have to rely really only on their constitutional powers and what comes of that situation. But today we're going to be talking about Jordan's latest book. It's called Adding the Lone Star, John Tyler, Sam Houston, and the Annexation of Texas. Looking forward to a great conversation. Jordan, thanks for taking the time to join us on The American Idea.
Thank you for having me.
All right. I think the title is pretty self-explanatory. Adding the Lone Star, John Tyler, Sam Houston, and the Annexation of Texas. Let me start with this. Of course, you know, a lot of our listeners are very historically informed, very historically interested, students, teachers, citizens around the country. But even for them, and for those who might not be quite so historically minded, why does it matter for America and our understanding of America and our history, this question of the annexation of Texas?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it does seem to be one of those things that just kind of happens in the antebellum pre-Civil War period. We don't usually give it much thought, but really, and I think some other scholars would say the annexation of Texas is that pivot point on the way to the Civil War. That prior to the annexation of Texas, we of course have the Louisiana Purchase, but it's a real question of how is America going to keep expanding west? Will it keep expanding west? And when we add Texas, it creates, first of all, the conflict with Mexico. We have to remember that Texas, while an independent republic during annexation, had previously been a Mexican state. It had gained its independence from Mexico less than 10 years before. Mexico still claimed it as a territory, as a state in their union. So it creates this conflict with Mexico, leads to the Mexican War. And out of that Mexican War, we then get a lot of new Western land. We've truly become a continental republic spanning the North American continent, which leads to questions of, okay, well, how are we going to integrate these new Western territories into the United States? Arizona, what's now Arizona, New Mexico, California, all of these territories, which then raises the questions about, well, what about slavery expanding into the West? So all these things that then become the flashpoints, the lead up to conflict in the 1850s until it finally bursts in the 1860s into the Civil War. Texas is that key pivot point. If Texas isn't annexed, we don't have the conflict with Mexico. If we don't have the conflict with Mexico, we don't have these Western territories. We don't fight about slavery in the Western territories, and on it goes. So really understanding why this happened, how it happened, and also I think some interesting constitutional questions about really what Texas is doing and what Americans in Texas were doing are very important for American history, and also considering too Texas history. The Texas Revolution has kind of been folded into American history, even though it is strictly speaking, taking place outside the United States. We still talk about Sam Houston, Davy Crockett, all these figures of Texas folklore.
Right. So let me ask you then, because it's interesting you say that, because again, for our listeners, we're locating this, when Texas becomes an independent republic, if I'm not mistaken, it's around 1835, 1836.
Right.
And it's still true to this day. I think a lot of Texans think of Texas as its own country in many ways. Let's start, if you can tell us, how did Texas originally become its own country?
Yeah, that's a good question. To your point about Texans thinking of themselves as their own country, I did my PhD at Baylor University in Texas, which was chartered by and under the Republic of Texas. So living down there for a while, I can confirm there's probably no place with more state pride than Texas and Texans. But to your question, it's a very interesting one. So Mexico gains its own independence in the 1820s. Texas originally, as a Mexican state, isn't just Texas. It's linked with another area of now northern Mexico. I'm going to butcher the pronunciation. My Spanish isn't that good. But the name of the state is Coahuila y Tejas. So it's not just Texas, but it's also this other area. And what you see throughout the 1820s is Mexico is trying to expand its population through this. So it offers these really land grants. It's offering a lot of benefits for people who are coming into that area, which was fairly sparsely populated. So what you see is a lot of Americans taking advantage of this, crossing into what's then what will become Texas, basically, and kind of making it a Mexican American, or really American Mexican sort of society, really changing the demographics of that area of Texas. But what you see in the 1830s then is there's a lot of issues with Mexican politics. I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but basically what happens is Santa Anna comes to power in Mexico, and he decides to throw out the Constitution of 1824, the Mexican Constitution of 1824. And this creates a lot of problems throughout Mexico, not just Texas, but you see a lot of rebellions throughout the rest of Mexico. Santa Anna is a general. He goes and starts crushing these rebellions, but he eventually makes it up to Texas. And so you have the Texas Revolution, as you say, 1835 into 1836. Initially, they're saying they just want to to save the Constitution of 1824. Independence isn't the first thing. It's very similar to the American Revolution, where independence comes later on, but eventually they decide we're going to declare independence. We get that in 1836, and it's a very surprising thing that they actually win it. What then are called the Texians are not exactly well equipped. It's a very ragtag army led by Sam Houston, who I'm sure we'll talk about more in a minute. But it's a surprise victory he wins at the Battle of San Jacinto, where he actually captures Santa Anna. They get some intelligence. They happen to surprise Santa Anna's forces. It's a quick 18-minute battle, and suddenly they've captured the dictator president of Mexico, and they can negotiate their own independence, which then the Mexicans say was coerced, so it doesn't count, which leads to the conflicts then, or Mexico's claims on Texas going forward. So it's quick, it's surprising, but that's basically what happens.
So then we've got a Texas Republic that sets itself up after the defeat of Mexico, claims its own independence. As you say, Mexico doesn't really want to accept that, but perhaps it's kind of forced to by circumstances. The Texans then start building their own republic. And we really get in your book the wonderful characters, people like Sam Houston. Tell us about the role of Sam Houston and other important figures in this new Texas Republic that I think goes for about 10 years.
Yeah, so Sam Houston really becomes, in a way, the George Washington of Texas. He had had a lot of political experience in the United States, really a protege of Andrew Jackson. Houston's from Tennessee, Jackson's from Tennessee. After a few personal problems, a failed marriage in particular, Houston leaves American politics, moves to Texas just before the revolution kicks off. But since he had military experience, since he was really the most, I think, politically experienced of the Texans at that point, he kind of shoots up like a meteor and is given command of the Texas Army. He defeats Santa Anna. And in the new elections, then, he is easily elected the president of the new republic. And to a large extent, Sam Houston dominates Texas's politics during its Republican period. There's a great quote from somebody reflecting back that says, really in Texas, you don't have parties. You're either pro-Houston or anti-Houston. So Houston becomes the sun around which Texas politics revolves during this period.
And so he is really, as you say, as important and as popular and significant to Texas as George Washington was to the United States.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, then Sam Houston is president of Texas. Why doesn't Texas just stay its own republic? As you say, it starts in about 1836. It goes for about 10 years before it becomes part of the United States. If the Texans like governing themselves, if they think they're their own country, why don't they stay their own country?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think the main reason would be that Texas is so insecure. And we like to think about Texas as huge state, very proud of its heritage. But at the time, Texas is really a small, sparsely populated, fairly weak republic. It's bordered by these two much more powerful neighbors in the United States and Mexico. And in the new Republic of Texas, most of the Texians are American immigrants. They are American by birth, by really political inclination. You do have Tejanos, who were the descendants of the original Spanish settlers, but for the most part, it's the new Anglo-Americans who dominate Texas politics. So very early on, there's a sense of, well, okay, we've declared independence from Mexico. Maybe we just rejoin the United States, go back home, so to speak, without actually having to move, but rejoin that country. And then we will solve our security problem. We won't have to worry about Mexico reconquering us. We will be more secure, and we'll be back with a regime that agrees with us on politics, that is in alignment with our values.
So is it the case that that's a uniform sentiment across Texas, that everybody sort of agrees, hey, it looks like our future is with the United States, or is there division in Texas over that question?
For the most part, it's pretty overwhelmingly pro-annexation, but that does tend to waver. So we have to say, too, Houston is not president during the entire history of the Republic of Texas. Houston serves 2 initial years as president of Texas under the new Texas Constitution. But then after that, he's term limited out. Then you get another president, Mirabeau Lamar, who actually isn't supportive of annexation. He wants Texas to make a go of it on its own. He has a vision of Texas being its own rival power to the United States, that maybe Texas should push to the west, push to California, and create this kind of new southwestern Texas republic that will rival the United States, that can stand on its own. The problem for Lamar is his administration is an absolute disaster. All his attempts to do this completely fall apart, which invigorates, I think, the movement towards annexation. But of course, the other problem is, and the reason Houston doesn't get it done early, is the Americans don't want Texas in 1836.
Well, that's interesting. I think people would say, wait a minute, if a lot of Texans like Sam Houston want to be part of the United States, and there's a lot of American immigrants in the country, you'd think everybody in America would say, well, that's just naturally going to become another state part of our union. How come the Americans don't want Texas?
Yeah, well, at the early point, President Andrew Jackson, who's looking at this, he is very supportive of Texas. In fact, his last act in office is to recognize Texas's independence. But his concern is really more about domestic politics, that adding Texas would add another slave state. It would create the kind of sectional divisions we see emerging later on when annexation becomes more of an issue. It would unbalance that very careful arrangement between free and slave states. And not only add another slave state, but considering how large Texas is, it's really possible that you could divide it into several slave states, which would create further problems. So Jackson, and keep in mind the timing, this is 1836. So we're going into a presidential election in the United States. Jackson is trying to get his other protege, Martin Van Buren, through, and he recognizes to annex Texas at this point would create these sectional divisions that would not only split the country, but perhaps split the Democratic Party at exactly the time he wants the Democrats to be united, he wants the country to stay united, or at least not have a large political fight over this, at least until after Van Buren gets elected. But then Van Buren in office too, it's the same sort of thing. He doesn't want to risk inflaming sectional tensions. So it takes a while before Americans warm up to this idea of annexation until we really get to the Tyler administration. He's the first president that says, no, this is a good thing. We should do it, which is interesting. This is before Texas had gained its independence, there had been efforts to buy Texas from Mexico under the John Quincy Adams and Jackson administrations. But to then bring it in an independent country raises all these additional problems, especially since Mexico still claimed it as its own state.
So the opposition to adding Texas to the Republic is from people like Jackson and Van Buren who say, I don't want to inflame the situation. But those who would be inflamed most, are they the Northerners? Are they the anti-slavery people? Are they the abolitionists? Or is it some other group?
Primarily abolitionists in particular. So a lot of abolitionists said that the whole issue of Texas independence and of annexation was a slaveholder's plot. It was a plot to increase the slave power in the United States. So that's the main opposition. And one interesting figure who you see change on this is John Quincy Adams, who as president wanted to buy Texas, but then that falls through, but then who becomes an extraordinary opponent of Texas annexation on this basic point, on the point that Texas will empower slavery in the American South and in the nation as a whole. So it does become a sectional issue with primarily Northern abolitionists, and you could extend it to the North generally as well, because it would be an additional Southern state that is opposed to annexation. Southerners generally really want to annex Texas. They think it's going to be a great thing for the exact opposite reasons that the North and abolitionists are opposed to it.
Right. So then during the Van Buren presidency from 1836 to 1840, you have Van Buren saying, well, let's not do this. But then John Tyler, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, right? As we remember, Tyler is the vice president who becomes president, right? And decides, as you said, to go forward with the idea of annexation. Why does Tyler want to move forward when people like Andrew Jackson before him had said, we better not do this?
Yeah, so Tyler is in an interesting situation compared to Jackson and Van Buren. So just to back up a little bit, Tyler himself had long been an advocate of Western expansion, kind of raised up in the Jefferson School, supported the Louisiana Purchase, supported the annexation of Florida and all these sorts of things. So he's kind of ideologically geared towards wanting to expand into the West. But the political situation he faces is also very different. So as you mentioned, he's a vice president who becomes president. So he doesn't have, strictly speaking, that electoral mandate or that popularity to start out with. He also gets kicked out of his own party. So he's a member of the Whig Party, and he vetoes some Whig legislation. They kick him out. So now he's in a difficult position. He's a president.
I think that he's one of the people you talked about as an isolated president. You can see why.
Yes, exactly right. He's unpopular. He doesn't have congressional support. He doesn't have party support. Really, when you compare, and this is why I put them in conversation, Tyler and Houston, politically, they are polar opposites. Houston, the dominant figure of Texas politics. Tyler, who nobody likes in American politics. Politically speaking, their situations couldn't be more different. So Tyler really is looking for a way to save his administration, to try to make sure, to try to win the presidency for himself in 1844. And so after he's kicked out of the party in September 1841, it's only in October 1841 he writes a letter to his Secretary of State, Dana Webster, where he says something to the effect of, would anything throw so much a luster on us as the annexation of Texas? So he sees, if I can add a star to the American constellation, that will secure my legacy and my election going forward. But even Tyler, he takes a little bit. So Houston gets a second term that coincides with Tyler's term. And Houston tries to get Tyler to jump on board, and Tyler hesitates for a couple years until finally he's convinced that the political situation is such that, okay, now we can go for it. We have the support. So again, domestic politics seems to dominate at least the Americans' considerations of when is it appropriate to annex Texas.
Before we continue with our conversation, I'd like to have one of our faculty members tell you about a special documents-based graduate program for teachers of American history, government,
and civics.
Hi, this is John Moser, Chair of the Master of Arts in American History and Government program at Ashland University. If you are an educator who teaches U.S. history, government, or politics, our program may be just what you've been looking for. Our approach is to emphasize primary sources, since we think the best way to study the past is to read the words of those who lived it. We have a distinguished faculty made up of professors from both Ashland University and from colleges and universities across the country. And they're not there to lecture to you. We think it's better to learn through conversation about the documents. Ours is a hybrid program with two different types of seminar. The first are our week-long intensive in-person courses during the summers on the beautiful campus of Ashland University. The second are our live synchronous online seminars offered throughout the year. So if you're a social studies teacher and you're looking to deepen your understanding of America's past and its politics, please check out the Master of Arts in American History and Government program. You can do that by visiting tah.org/programs.
All right, then what pushes it over the line so that the thing lines up in Texas saying, yes, we want to become part of America, and in the United States saying, yes, we want Texas? How do those two things come together, and when do they come together?
Yeah, good question. So with Texas, I mentioned that in American politics, domestic issues are really driving the considerations. In Texas, it's international questions. Houston comes back into office not long before Tyler gets into office. And looking at the Lamar administration, the idea of an independent Texas over the long term is pretty much, it's discredited more or less. So annexation becomes Houston's key thing. But we also start to see raids from Mexico into Texas. So there's a real threat that Mexico is going to reinvade, reconquer Texas, destroy the republic in its crib, so to speak. So Houston recognizes their situation is very tenuous. So what he tries to do is, since Tyler's not being very receptive, let's find ways to pressure the Americans. So Houston, and to bolster their position relative to Mexico. So what Houston focuses on is Europe. Let's get the Europeans to support us. So he negotiates with Britain. He gets Britain and France to kind of be the mediators in figuring out peace talks with Mexico. But at the same time, he cozies up to England quite a bit. He gives the impression that Texas, were it to remain an independent republic, is going to fall under the orbit of the British Empire. Now, he doesn't seem to be that serious about it in his heart of hearts. It's a strategic point. Because what he wants to do is he wants the Americans to see that so that they get scared and will go ahead and annex Texas.
I see. He wants to rely on the old American sort of suspicion of Britain, right? And play that card and say get the Americans to say, oh, we don't want you to be part of Britain. You really got to be part of the United States.
Exactly right. He wants to play Britain and the United States against each other. The theory being that Americans will realize a British-aligned Texas is not only a threat to their Western expansion, right? You now have this large republic affiliated with Britain on the southwestern border. At the same time, there's disputes with Britain over the Oregon territory. Where exactly is the border? So this whole question of, is Britain going to box the United States out in moving west across the continent? Texas would make that much more difficult. But also the slavery question. Mexico had abolished slavery in the 1820s. The Americans in Texas had reintroduced slavery during the period of independence. But in cozying up to Britain, it gives the impression, at least to Southerners, that, well, what if Texas becomes so close to Britain, they abolish slavery?
Because the British had, by that time, begun the process of abolishing slavery across the empire.
Yes, and it was a stated policy of the British government to push for abolition. Now, the British themselves say, we're not going to force Texas to abolish, but Houston implies that maybe they would be open to it. I don't think he's really serious about doing that, but he gives that sort of implication, I think, as part of this game, to then scare Southern Americans. Oh, now not only just have a British-aligned republic, but a free republic that our slaves might escape to, that would put pressure and really box in the South and the slave-holding states. So all that to say, Texas really is in this international position. That's what Houston tries to do. And the strategy works. It does scare the annexationists in the United States, including Tyler and the Southerners in his cabinet, who by 1843 are dominating Tyler's cabinet. And so that's when he decides, okay, the circumstances are right. My administration is fully on board with annexation. The South seems to be pretty on board. In the North, maybe we can convince them that this is going to be good for the Union as a whole with the economic prospects. So it's about late 1843, early 1844, Tyler says, let's go for it.
That's the why, as you pointed out, but then there is the how. And it's
Yeah.
a really tricky question because Texas is an independent country. It even seems like the way you're putting it, really a full-fledged independent country. It's conducting foreign affairs and relations. I don't know if it has its own currency, but it certainly has its own economy.
Yes.
So it does seem like it's its own country. The United States, up until this point, has been adding territory, but never by absorbing an actual country into it. How does this happen?
Yeah, that's the key question, and it raises some tricky constitutional issues. Initially, the thought is, well, we'll make a treaty with Texas, an annexation treaty that will bring Texas in as a territory, not as a state. Initially, the terms were that Texas would come in as a treaty like Louisiana Purchase and all these other territories had been added. Unfortunately for Tyler and for Houston, that doesn't exactly go well. They create the treaty in secret, and Tyler presents it pretty much fully formed to the Senate, and the Senate balks at the idea. They say, no, we can't do this. And it fails by a 2/3 vote. And as you and your listeners might know, you need a 2/3 vote to ratify. This goes the exact opposite way. It is a complete failure. Part of that is due to how it's presented. So at this point, Tyler Secretary of State is John C. Calhoun, very much pro-slavery Southerner. And he presents Texas as an explicitly pro-slavery measure, whereas Tyler was trying to present it as good for the nation as a whole. Calhoun makes it a sectional issue, which the Senate is not going to go for at all. So the treaty fails. And that then creates a question, well, how can we do it? This is an independent, as you say, it's an independent country. How do we get an independent country annexed to the Union? And Tyler takes what at the time and even now is a kind of innovative constitutional approach where it says, okay, if we can't do a treaty, let's annex it as a state. Let's go to the admissions clause of the Constitution, which just says that new states can be added by a majority vote of both houses. We don't need the 2/3 in the Senate, just a majority in the House and the Senate. But that creates all kinds of constitutional questions of, is that actually constitutional? Can we add a whole country as a state? Even Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of the Treasury, Albert Gallatin, kind of the last founding father lingering on, he comes out of retirement to say, this is unconstitutional. This goes against Jeffersonian principles, against strict construction that Tyler claims to uphold. So it creates all these constitutional arguments about how do you run foreign affairs? How do you deal with foreign nations? How do we interpret the admissions clause?
And then, so what happens? Does Texas then come in as a territory and quickly organize as a state? Does it come in as a state, or does it come in some other way? How's this really thorny problem resolved?
Eventually by voting. So Tyler and Houston are in a way very lucky that this all happens in 1844 in the run-up to a presidential election. And initially, this is done before the party conventions. So you have the two leading candidates for the Democratic and the Whig parties take a stand on Texas. The treaty comes out and both of them almost immediately say, no, we should not annex Texas. On the Democratic side, that's Martin Van Buren. He's trying to make a comeback, have a non-consecutive term. Your listeners might be familiar with that at the moment, given we also have a president trying to make a non-consecutive run. And on the other side, it's Henry Clay, Tyler's old enemy in the Whig party, who is going to be the undisputed Whig nominee. Now, that goes well for Clay, and it kind of paints Clay and the Whig party as the anti-annexation party. Van Buren is a little trickier. You get into the Democratic convention, and Van Buren's anti-annexation stance is probably what loses him the nomination, because you have Southern Democrats, other really just anti-Van Buren folks creating a coalition to say not Van Buren. And the compromise they come to is the ultimate dark horse candidate, James K. Polk, who was pro-Van Buren, but he was also pro-annexation. So Polk, as a nominee, makes the Democrats really the pro-annexation party. Now, Tyler himself does try to run. He tries to form his own third party. He even has his convention slogan be Tyler in Texas. He's going to tie himself to Texas as his ticket, but that doesn't work out. So Tyler's then persuaded, if I endorse Polk, we can tie Texas to Polk. If Polk wins, that's how we get it through, which is ultimately what happens. Polk wins a narrow victory over Clay in the election of 1844, and Tyler uses that electoral energy to say, look, the people have voted. The majority of the states now, as represented in the Electoral College, have voted. Polk is a victor, and Polk won for his support of annexation. So it's in that lame duck period between Polk's election and Polk's inauguration that Tyler makes this big push. And that popular energy ultimately is what gets the annexation resolution through both houses of Congress. There's a little bit of finagling about how it would be done. And actually, the resolution that's passed leaves some discretion to the president. So some members of Congress thought, well, we'll leave it to the president's discretion, then Polk can decide if he wants to reopen negotiations or not. But Tyler, in what comes very characteristic Tyler fashion, in his last days in office says, well, we have the resolution, I'm just going to do it. And he sends off a messenger to Texas to say, you're in, let's get this sorted. It's days before Polk comes into office. And so by the time Polk comes in, he says, well, let's just do it. And so it's that tying Texas to the election is what really pushes it through and enables its success.
What's the reaction in Texas?
From the people, very positive. And it's interesting because at the same time you have the election in the United States, there's also an election going on in Texas. Houston is term limited out again under the Texas Constitution. His Secretary of State, Anson Jones, wins the election there. And Jones is a bit ambivalent about whether he should accept the Texas offer. They had at the same time been negotiating with Mexico. Mexico seemed more interested in peace and perhaps recognizing an independent Texas. So accepting annexation would blow that up, so to speak, and probably cause some conflict. So Jones toys with the idea of rejecting the proposal, but popular opinion, just like in the United States, is what convinces Jones to go with it. Popular opinion in Texas being so overwhelming for annexation that Jones accepts the resolution and calls for a new state constitution convention to assemble later that year, which is how we get the organization as a state very quickly after the resolution is passed and disseminated to Texas.
So are there still holdouts in America who, even though it seems like the annexation is popular in Texas, it's voted and approved in the convention, it's supported by the new administration, are there holdouts? I'm thinking some famous names in American politics and American history, people like Abraham Lincoln. What's Lincoln's view of the annexation of Texas?
Well, that's a good question. I don't strictly know what Lincoln's view of it is. He, of course, is an opponent of the Mexican War that results out of the annexation. And I'd be willing to speculate that given Lincoln's position as a loyal Whig, loyal supporter of Henry Clay, he was opposed to annexation like Clay was. But more specifically, I don't know if he said anything explicitly, either in writings or publicly.
But as you said, Lincoln is a pretty ferocious opponent of the Mexican-American War. He thinks the Polk administration kind of starts the war and acts unwisely and even unconstitutionally in sparking the war. But take us to that moment, because that's a really important moment in American history, right? It's the Mexican-American War and American victory that opens things up in such a way that speeds up the accelerates the train heading towards the Civil War. How does annexation spark the Mexican-American War?
Yeah, so essentially the issue is that nobody exactly knows where the Texas border is. So Texians and the Americans, after annexation, both claim it's the Rio Grande.
Now it's clearly the Rio Grande. It was not clearly then?
It was not clear then. That's what the Texians and Americans said it was the Rio Grande. That remained consistent. The Mexicans said, no, it's a little farther north at the Nueces River. So there you have this really disputed area. And this is where Lincoln, I think, comes in, because Polk, as commander-in-chief, he sends American troops to what he believes is the now American border on the Rio Grande. The Mexican government sends their troops up to what they think is the Mexican border on the Nueces River, and that's where you have the conflict of American and Mexican troops come into conflict. That sparks the war. Polk claims it's American blood on American soil. The Mexicans say, no, it's Mexican blood on Mexican soil. And that's where Lincoln comes in with his spot resolutions in Congress, where he says, well, we need to know the spot, right? Was this undisputably American territory where American blood was shed, showing Mexican aggression, or is Polk playing fast and loose with the facts on where blood has been spilt and the causes of the war? So right, it's the disputed territory, but Polk presents it as, no, this is American territory, therefore we need to go to war. Lincoln, a lot of Whigs, a lot of anti-war folks point out it's not that clear. And by positioning troops in a disputed area, Polk seems to have just been asking for trouble rather than clarifying diplomatically, which he very well could have done.
So now that Texas is annexed, I'm thinking about the long-term ripple effects, not only accelerating us toward the Civil War and the conflict over slavery in the Western territories, but even the place of Texas in American life after the Civil War and maybe even today. I mean, there's Houston, Texas, there's Tyler, Texas. Some of these names are enshrined forever in the geography of Texas. I'm just wondering, Texans become part of the United States. Do they then say, okay, now we're Americans, we're all in on America, or do they say we're in on America, but really we're still Texans first, and we're still kind of our own country?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of that, especially in the years immediately succeeding annexation. And I think we see this particularly during the secession crisis. So by this time, Houston, who had been serving as United States Senator, becomes the governor of Texas. So from president to senator to governor, it's kind of a reverse order of things for Houston. But during the secession crisis, Houston is pretty animately a unionist. He is opposed to Lincoln's election, but once Lincoln is elected, he says we shouldn't leave the Union. We can find other ways to, slow down the Lincoln administration, these sorts of things. But Texas votes to secede. And the way Houston at least approaches it is he says, okay, we can secede, but that just means we've now reassumed our authority as the Republic of Texas, right? We're just going to be our own nation again. The problem comes when the other Texans say, no, we actually want to join the Confederacy. And Houston says, that's not what we signed up for when we seceded. So Houston, in a way, I think was trying to avoid really getting involved and trying to say, oh, if we were independent once, let's just be independent again. That doesn't work out. And when he opposes joining the Confederacy, the governorship is declared vacant, and that's the end of Houston's political career.
Ah, wow. Okay. And then, of course, Texas joins the Confederacy. Obviously, the Confederacy loses the Civil War, and then Texas is reorganized again into a state in the United States. The title of your book, Adding the Lone Star. Those of us who are not from Texas, the Lone Star. Why does Texas call it? Why is its flag a Lone Star? Is it connected to annexation? Help us understand the title.
Yeah, so it's connected initially to independence. There were a couple Texas flags that were developed during the period of the Texas Revolution, certainly, and all of them just have the single star either in the middle of the flag or in the flag that we know now, with the blue on the one side, the white star, and then the white stripe and the red stripe, in really a simplified version of the American flag. And I think that's how a lot of Texans at the time of the Revolution and then during the period of independence thought, well, this is a kind of American republic, so we're going to play off of that. But it is its own thing, right? It's its own independent star, which then, and this is why I said adding the Lone Star, we're taking that Lone Star and adding it into the broader American constellation. But I think it is significant and does signal Texas's idea of itself as being able to stand on its own, being able to be its own functioning republic. And that idea has, I think, permeated into really what I want to say. I was going to say the soul of Texans, and maybe that's too broad, but something to that. Just a general mindset of Texans, and that no, we've been independent before. We have our own history. We have our own founding fathers, which is really where I started thinking about Sam Houston, is this idea that Texas has its own founding fathers. It has its own revolution. And there's something significant to that, even as we fold it into the American story. And I think it orients us when we think about American history to, Texas is the most obvious example of a state that has its own significant history, but how we should think about American history, not just on the national level, not just with this national scope, but that there are these smaller stories. States have histories, localities have histories, and those histories shape the people who live there, shape what they bring then when they go to Washington, either in Congress or in other roles. And it's important to recognize that and to think about that, and really how all the Lone Stars of each of the 50 states do come together. The E pluribus unum from many one. Texas, despite its uniqueness, became one with the rest of the country. And there's a history there that we need to recognize and just see the richness of the American story. And I think looking at Texas helps remind us of that in a significant way, perhaps one of the most evident ways. But I think it would be great for us who work in America, who research American politics, American political thought, American history, to think about that more and how these things all kind of come together.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Wow, what a fascinating look at a fascinating state, at a fascinating time in American history. Part Mexico, part America, and maybe all Texas. Jordan Cash, the book is Adding the Lone Star, John Tyler, Sam Houston, and the Annexation of Texas. Thanks, Jordan, again for joining us on The American Idea.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you want to learn more or get involved in Ashbrook's vital work, visit our website, ashbrook.org.